Russian Anna Smirnova has been sitting on a chair for almost an hour after the end of her fencing match at the World Championship. She wants to shake hands with Olga Harlan in front of the cameras, although she knows the Ukrainian will not do so.
Before this, I had already stated that I will never shake hands with any Russian or Belarusian athletes.
Sport has always been an important part of the international image of any state, and for totalitarian regimes, it is also a powerful propaganda tool. Hello guys, my name is Anna and I'm from Ukraine, and I have decided to vlog daily to keep you updated on the real-life situation in my country as this war with Russia continues. My name is Anna. I run an English language vlog where I tell the world about the war in Ukraine. For me, it is obvious that this war is not limited to military operations. World sports today is a platform from which Russia wants to overcome its international isolation, despite the fact that its war and its crimes continue. At the beginning of full-scale invasion, the world of sports supported Ukraine. Russian athletes were suspended from most international competitions. But what happens next? Russian money, connections and lies are bringing the Russians back, to begin with as neutral participants.
I realized that something was going to happen. I still hoped that I wouldn't be so unlucky as to have my first bout at the World Championships be against a Russian athlete. But I accepted it. We had an agreement with the acting president of the International Federation that I would use the COVID protocol. The COVID protocol means that you don't approach or shake hands. Instead, you touch sabers, and that's it. You touch weapons and part ways.
After defeating the Russian, Olga Harlan held her saber forward. This is how she performed the important greeting between opponents required by the rules.
I saw her take the saber away, just like that, behind her back. So it wasn't a surprise for her, because if a person didn't know that was going to happen, she wouldn't act so deliberately. That's why I took it as a provocation. I knew it would be like this. I knew that they would do it, but I didn't want to fully believe it. I probably underestimated the nature of these people and the politics that they are now bringing into sports.
It turns out that Russians are capable of political demonstrations. It's a pity they are not against Putin.
The Russians maybe wanted to make a political vision out of it. They wanted to make a show that sport was going to be for peace and for healing and make a publicity stunt almost. And obviously it's not going to do that. A handshake is not going to do that when your country is invading another. And that was, I think, one of the major reasons why she turned it down. So I think it is perfectly fine to not to make an acknowledgement like that if, as a sports person, you think it's going to be used as a publicity stunt.
What Smirnova does after the fight is over definitely goes beyond the neutrality of an athlete. Just like these photos. In them, the neutral Smirnova is proud of her brother, a military invader.
People around the world understand when a Ukrainian won't shake the hand of a Russian. The Russian propaganda says, oh, this is racist, this is anti-Russian. It's a good time to be anti-Russian.
It was a clear provocation to create a newsworthy event that could be twisted to make it seem like it was the Ukrainians' fault, that she didn't even want to shake hands. In other words, the war was pushed out of frame by these emotions, as was the question of who should be shaking hands with who, and why two warring sides should be shaking hands at all, especially when we're talking about a victim. Essentially, this was a completely staged situation.
Following the complaint from the Russian team, the International Fencing Federation disqualified the Ukrainian from the World Championship.
The Russian coaches and another person were sitting there. No one knows who this other person was. They weren't accredited. They were the ones who wrote and filed a protest. She didn't write it herself. They said, either you go and shake hands, or you'll get a black card. I replied, I'm not going to shake hands, and there won't be a black card either. They didn't know what to do in this situation, because, according to the rules, they should have given me a black card right away. However, they chose to follow through and give me a black card. I think this was very harsh not only on me, but also on the referee who judged me, because they forced the referee to give me a black card an hour and a half after the fight.
Olga Harlan's position could have cost her a spot at the Olympics. Harlan was losing points that would have allowed her to qualify for the Games in Paris in the summer of 2024.
The president of the International Olympic Committee personally made the following gesture due to the strong publicity. He issued an automatic license to Olga Harlan for the Olympics. It was a kind of a gesture that what the International Federation did was wrong.
Fencing was one of the first sports in which the International Federation returned Russians to competition in early March 2023. This decision will not come as a surprise when you know that for the last 15 years, from 2008 to 2022, the International Fencing Federation was headed by Russian billionaire Alisher Usmanov. For several years, he was the richest man in Russia. He was called Putin's favorite oligarch. From this perspective, the rapid return of the Russians, Harlan's disqualification, and the defiant behavior of Russian Smirnova received a logical explanation.
Of course, we always felt their presence when Usmanov was still the president of the International Federation. I think money does have some power. And of course, we felt this during the Olympic Games. The most interesting thing is that they are strong on their own. They are strong. They win. They are good fencers. No one is saying they are useless. No, they're good. But when even the stronger ones are helped in this way, it feels unsportsmanlike.
In most international federations, Russians are represented either in the executive committees or even as presidents or vice presidents of federations. The International Boxing Federation is now in a serious confrontation with the International Olympic Committee. Last year, there were 2 or 3 precedents for re-elections because there was a suspicion of fraud. And finally, the president of the International Boxing Federation, the IBF, is a Russian, Umar Kremlov. Several times his competitors protested the election results. There were re-elections and he still won. And Gazprom is still the main sponsor there.
International sports federations are non-governmental organizations that regulate the activities of various sports, set rules in each of them and organize championships and competitions. International ones include representatives of national sports federations. Governing bodies are elected by voting.
In most sports, European countries are the governing powers, because sports are developing most actively here. But since each country has one vote, how many European countries are there? 30, 40? And they cannot compete against 1,500 countries in the African, South American and Asian regions. And due to the fact that Russia has been integrating its leverage in these countries for decades, which also have one vote each, they thus got their presidents in international federations.
Today, loyalty to Russian and Belarus athletes in various sports, their admission to competitions can be traced to the presence of Russian leadership and lobby in the federations.
The Russians have been integrating into international sports for a long time, probably actively since Putin's first term in office. They started integrating with money and other connections. The president of the International Chess Federation is also Russian. The president of the International Boxing Federation is Russian. And it is precisely in these federations that Russians are now either not suspended, or it is the most difficult to fight for their suspension. All Russian athletes who are competing today are a huge advertisement for the Russian war. Both these competitions and these athletes are responsible, even if indirectly, but they are responsible for the fallen in Ukraine.
On the third day of the invasion of Ukraine, the International Judo Federation suspended Putin as honorary president of the organization. For many years, Putin has been demonstratively honoring this type of fighting. From time to time, he even defeats Russia's strongest judokas on camera. The federation's integrity, however, did not last long. In May, they admitted 18 neutral athletes from Russia to the World Championship. 15 out of 18 neutrals were career military personnel from the Russian Armed Forces, CSKA, and the National Guard of Russia.
Ever since the Soviet era, a lot of athletes in Russia have been active officers in either the armed forces or the special services, while other post-Soviet countries are now dissociating themselves from this practice. Russia, on the contrary, is increasing its influence. Some of their athletes came out with the Z logo when the Russian army started using it at the beginning of the full-scale invasion. They made these patches for themselves instead of the coat of arms of the Russian Federation, and thus demonstrated their full commitment to the Russian army.
Such athletes have no right to compete. In March 2023, the International Olympic Committee developed recommendations on which athletes from Russia and Belarus can be allowed to compete. Thus, only individual athletes are allowed to compete, not teams. Athletes who actively support Russia's military aggression cannot compete, and those who have contracts with state armies cannot compete. They cannot, but they compete.
They say that Russian athletes are officers, but they don't take part in combat. They say that this is just one of the ways to keep a competitive country out of sports, that otherwise the Russians would have won all the medals. Russia is like a shark. If it smells blood, if it sees that there are loopholes where they can shove their athlete officers into the Olympics, they will do it.
It's a tradition that comes from the USSR, where sports, like most public spheres, were controlled by the authorities. The Soviet Union had a system of sports societies. Some of them were affiliated with power structures. CSKA was the central sports club of the army. Dynamo was the departmental society of the Ministry of Internal Affairs and State Security. So most of the leading athletes were, and still are, officers of the army, police and special services.
An athlete in a uniform in Russia is always more than just an athlete, and every soldier knows this from an early age. They are dependent, you know. Most of the athletes are nominally, but still, either the members of the Central Sports Club, an army club, or the Ministry of the Inferior. That is, they are listed as officers, girls and boys. So it's like this. There is an order, there is a directive in these sports societies, and they fulfill this directive.
If this athlete says, we are not on the front lines, then also say your army is wrong. Say that your army is the aggressor, because that is the truth. Your army is on the territory of another country. Why don't you say this, instead of pretending that everything is fine, and you have nothing to do with it? Then quit the army. Why don't you leave the army?
This is one of the neutral judokas admitted to the European Championships in the fall of 2023. Madina Taymazova is a warrant officer in the Russian Federation Army.
Judo disregards absolutely all the rules and allows Russians to be photographed in front of the Z logo, even on social media. And they still perform.
To the public eye, Russian sports officials are categorically dissatisfied and outraged. by the rules of participation of athletes without the flags and anthem. Although they go to perform wherever they are allowed, the suspension from the competition is called mass Russophobia. The Olympic champion, legendary Czech hockey player Dominik Hasek played in Russia and was a public favorite until he supported Ukraine. If you support Ukraine, you immediately become a Russophobe.
I'm not interested in what people in Russia say about me. For me, it's important to call a spade, to tell it like it is, that Russia is waging an imperialist war to seize new territories, that Putin is a criminal, that genocide is taking place in Ukraine, and so on. If some Russians, even former teammates, criticize me, it's their opinion. It's not a problem for me. It's more important for me to tell them the truth. The whole country there is set up by this propaganda, wild fascist propaganda, that we are the first, we're the strongest, and now the whole world is against us.
Irina Rodnina, a former figure skater and now a member of the State Duma, says she does not understand why Russia is being punished. She said, they want to humiliate us. Irina Wiener-Usmanova, the head of the Russian Rhythmic Gymnastics Federation and the wife of the before-mentioned Alisher Usmanov, adds, Russophobia is becoming widespread. Such statements from Russian sports officials are rampant.
For the Russian audience, this is yet another piece of evidence that the West, this supposedly terrible entity, is oppressing us, Russians, even here, that we defeated them, and now they are taking revenge on us. In reality, this is a completely typical part of Russian propaganda, which extends into sports, literature, and everything else. Any legitimate scandal involving any Russian person in the West, they twist and present to their audience as persecution.
I don't think in sport there is any such thing as Russophobia. I think people will take a situation as they see it. I think if in a completely parallel universe, Ukraine had invaded another country and annexed it or colonized it, people would condemn that. But that's not. But that is not what has happened. Russia has committed this aggressive act. People see that and they take it as they see it.
This line of defense has been rehearsed by Russia since 2014, after it was exposed in the largest doping scandal in the history of sports.
The Winter Olympics in Sochi is a vivid example of how sports has been put first in Russia's political games.
Billions of dollars were spent on preparation for the 2014 Winter Olympics in Sochi. For Putin's PR, because the Olympic infrastructure does not bring any sporting benefits after the games are over.
This is a huge bubble that is not used anywhere now. Nobody needs all these arenas. But the Olympics were held there because Russia wanted to host them, because Russia wanted everyone to talk about it, so that everyone would come and see, wow. The Sochi Olympics are also known for the huge number of doping scandals that took place there. They won gold medals on doping and won the Winter Olympics by 1 wicket, as we say in sports. After that, this doping scandal broke out very quickly.
The Russians were so eager to be the first in the medal standings on their home Olympics that they organized a grand scheme and believed that they would get away with it at home. The Russian Ministry of Sports concealed positive doping tests of its athletes by replacing the samples with clean ones.
It was proved that there was state interference in the research laboratory, which was checking the athletes' samples to see if there was doping or not. That is, there was a substitution of test results in 2014. And thus Russia was exposed as having a doping policy that was fully controlled at the state level, supported at the state level. And after that, Russians were suspended from most sports, and Russian athletes became neutral athletes.
Russia was banned from participating in the 2018 Olympics under its own flag, as a punishment for a gross violation of the principles of integrity. But of course, no one there recognized the big sports lie. The old "enemies are everywhere" record was played.
Russian culture has a peculiar attitude to punishment. Let's think of Dostoevsky, for example. We see that for a Russian, punishment for a crime is not quite the same as in Western ideology. Sometimes it can even be a big plus that a person took a risk and committed a crime.
They're really all about sports, all about winning, and only victory. They did not believe that you could be third or fourth, the second, but only the first. Gradually, they are starting to get used to the fact that they are not so good.
The FIFA World Cup is a grand sporting event. Here, same as at the Sochi Olympics, Russia is involved in a major scandal. After several years of investigations, US prosecutors filed formal charges of corruption against FIFA in the process of determining the right to host the World Cup in Russia and Qatar. Huge bribes, dozens of offshore companies and accounts. Votes in favor of Russia were estimated at millions of dollars.
4 years since Russia annexed the territory of an independent state. 4 years since Russia brought its hybrid and non-hybrid army into the territory of Ukraine in the Donetsk and Luhansk regions. 4 years since Russia shot down Boeing MH17. And the Russian Federation is awarded the right to host the FIFA World Cup? So there is nothing surprising.
And all the world knew that this was happening, but all of us, and I'm counting the media in this too, went to the tournament. We probably all said and wrote that Russia had put on a great time. Everyone was singing and dancing in the streets. It was all better than people had heard about from outside. And people didn't really make that connection with what was happening in Donbass and what was happening in Crimea and the show that Russia was trying to project. And I think that was a major failure, and I include myself in this, of our media and our people in public life here not to point it out more clearly. Because I think when you look back, you could see what was coming down the line, and you could see that the awful things we've seen in the last year and 3 quarters were probably coming down the track. So I think the 2018 World Cup is a very potent example of a country laundering its image.
Russian money has long been at work in European football. Gazprom was a sponsor of the Champions League and German Schalke. The Serbian Red Star has said that it has no plans to refuse Russian money and terminate the contract.
Russia did a lot in 2000s and 2010s. The story of Roman Abramovich and Chelsea is a similar story. It's about trying to enter an elite club in Britain through a football club. This is called sport washing. They are simply whitewashing their reputation through sports.
In 2022, the British authorities allowed Abramovich, who was under sanctions, to sell Chelsea, on the condition that the money would go to help victims of the war in Ukraine. On the 22nd of May, the deal was finalized and the football club was sold for £2.5 billion. But the money has not yet reached Ukraine. Abramovich changed his mind about signing the transfer. He wants to divide the money between Ukraine and Russia, because Russians are also suffering. After the Hamas attack, Abramovich offered to transfer the money to Israel.
Roman Abramovich, who is now obviously very heavily sanctioned in the UK, but his purchase of Chelsea many years ago now, 2 decades ago, really opened the floodgates for a new kind of money in football. It really galvanised football as an entertainment, big money business with wealthy foreign owners. And, you know, football is such a popular sport here in the world. The Premier League is a massive global brand. It's the biggest global sporting brand. It's show business. If people are seeing the products of the money and liking it, they're not going to ask where the money's coming from. And there wasn't much investigation. There was some, but in the public in the public imagination, there wasn't much investigation of where that money was coming from and why it was being invested and what the consequences were going to be.
According to the contract, Gazprom paid UEFA about 40 million euros per season.
Gazprom was a huge contract for European football. Every Champions League game, many major games, that was the first name that you saw around the advertising hoarding around the pitch. It was worth millions and millions and millions of pounds, of euros. I think one of the most sensible things that did happen early on was that contract.
Russian clubs were suspended from participating in European Cups. The Russian national team was removed from the selection for the World Cup in Qatar. But there are things that football world still turns a blind eye to. For example, contracts for showing matches in Russia are not cancelled, despite the fact that broadcasts are openly censored there. After the West Ham-Sevilla match, Match TV replaced the footage with the Ukrainian flag in the stands. Instead of Ukrainian Andriy Yarmolenko celebrating the winning goal, they showed a man chewing a burger. And the broadcast of the Borussia Leipzig match was simply interrupted when they saw that the stadium had banners "Stop the War" and "We Stand with Ukraine." UEFA President Alexander Cheferin spoke out in support of Russian athletes.
It breaks my heart to sanction the athletes because it's not their war. It's not good that they suffer because of this. I feel sorry for all the athletes, both Ukrainian and Russian. They, especially the Russian football players, have become victims of the conflict. They have suffered because of the absurd and crazy decisions of a few people.
And what about the affected Russian football players? The Russian Football Union, which was never expelled from the UEFA, co-organized a gala match in occupied Luhansk in fall of 2023. The head of the Russian Football Union, Alexander Dyukov, remains in the UEFA management team. In total, 15 Russians will work in the administrative bodies of the European Federation from 2023 to 2027.
If you're keeping key Russian administrators in these seats of power, they're surely going to have some kind of influence. There was a situation in football very recently where Russian under-17 teams were given permission by UEFA and FIFA to compete again on an international level. The problem they have had since then is that most of the individual federations in Europe, such as the Swedish, the Danes, the Germans, the English, have not wanted to play them. But I think while there are Russians sitting in major seats of authority in governing bodies, there is always going to be, consciously or not, some appetite to appease them.
Different federations have different approaches. In tennis, the Russians and Belarusians were punished only formally. They were banned from participating in team tournaments, which, you see, is not the biggest problem in tennis. Tennis players continue to travel the world, earning considerable prize money. For example, neutral Russian tennis player Daniil Medvedev earned more than $11 million in prize money in 2023.
In the circumstances of such unjustified and unprecedented military aggression, it would be unacceptable for the Russian regime to derive any benefits from the involvement of Russian and Belarusian players with the championship.
This was the principled statement of the prestigious British tennis tournament Wimbledon. It was the only one of the Grand Slams that did not allow athletes from Russia and Belarus to compete in 2022. Wimbledon is the oldest tennis competition in the world, almost 150 years old. Unlike other Grand Slam tournaments, it is organized by a private club, not a tennis federation. Another important tradition of Wimbledon is that every year the championship's trophy is presented to the winner by the representative of the British royal family.
They could not imagine that the royal family would be forced to present the Wimbledon trophy to so-called neutral athletes from Russia or Belarus. It would be a collapse for their domestic and international policy, and they realize that if this happens, the royal family will simply not come, and thus the tradition that has been going on for hundreds of years would be interrupted.
Wimbledon wanted to set an example. Instead, it received fines for not allowing Russians to attend. However, the problem is not financial losses, but the fact that the rest of the tennis world was not fundamentally against Russians playing.
I'm lucky enough to know the people who directly manage the Wimbledon competition. Jamie Baker is the manager of the competition. He is actually my peer. We competed with him back on the court. I had long conversations with him last year. They were hurt. They didn't expect to get any support. No one supported them. And that was painful for them. And that's why they didn't do it this year.
Wimbledon took a different route to the other three majors in tennis. They decided to ban Russians completely. Which made a lot of ripples in the sports world, and there were a lot of people discussing, how can this be? Should we be banning Russians from everyday life and their jobs? Should we send them home? What should we do? But the point, I think, and looking back on it, 18 months later, I think it was the right thing to do, and it's a shame that their position has now changed because it softens the world's stance towards what is happening in Ukraine.
It was very striking at Wimbledon this year to see that the Russian players who were competing, a lot of them were very outwardly trying to show a good mood and be very cooperative with the media and be very friendly. And again, I think try to show this positive image of their country. And I imagine there was a lot of discussion about how they should present themselves.
The 2022 tournament was won by a representative of Kazakhstan. Since recently, the representative of Kazakhstan. Yelena Rybakina is a Russian woman who changed her passport in 2018.
She won the tournament and was asked at a press conference after the victory, "How do you feel about what's happening?" And she came off as, "I don't understand. I don't speak English well. Can you ask another question?" And accordingly, even those who advocate for other countries, even though they don't risk losing any state funding, they don't comment on the situation in Russia. They are silent. And indeed, this silence is support for what is happening.
The same Daniil Medvedev, the best tennis player in Russia, who lives in Monaco, by the way, limited himself to the standard excuse for world peace.
I know that he and his family left Russia somewhere in 2017. None of his relatives live in Russia. But he, like that fish, took a mouthful of water. He is still silent and has not said anything about what is happening in Ukraine.
Silence is complicity. If your country is invading another one by force or trying to occupy their territory, you cannot be neutral. You cannot be neutral. You have an opinion on it.
The vast majority of Russian athletes take the position of keeping quiet no matter what. The maximum they can squeeze out of themselves to gain access to competitions is standard slogans for world peace or that they are against the war. Russian athletes generally do not condemn the actions of their state. To be eligible to return to international competitions, they have to sign the Declaration of Neutrality.
I've seen what they signed, and honestly, it's nothing. It says, "I abide by the Olympic rules, the Olympic Charter, and so on." But this isn't true. They aren't abiding by these rules. And all they have to pledge is to follow the rules. But where is "I am against the war"? At least minimally against the war. That isn't there. It isn't there at all. So, they are signing nothing.
Many of the greatest problems in the world happen because people just do nothing. Right now, and look, if we look at the situation in Ukraine, if the Western world and the powers that be had made an intervention in 2014, when Crimea was annexed, then maybe we wouldn't be having this discussion right now.
Silence kills, and this is a fact. They are not hostages of the situation. They are not afraid for their lives. They are not afraid. There are no precedents. Of the 1% of athletes who spoke out and condemned Russia's invasion, nothing happened to them. They were not sentenced to long terms. They were not arrested. Nothing happened to them. So to say that they are hostages is ridiculous. They support what is happening. They also stand for this united, great Russia. They are out for the fact that the whole world is oppressing them, that everyone does not like them because they are Russians, and they are the most correct. Unfortunately, this is all true. As much as I feel sorry for them, they are who they are. They want Ukraine not to exist. They are ready to turn a blind eye to the fact that Ukrainians are being killed, and they don't care.
For many years now, a Russian man, Alexander Ovechkin, has been living in the heart of the decaying West. He lives and plays in the capitalist NHL Hockey League, earning millions of American dollars. But he is passionate about Russia and supports Putin. He was the initiator of the so-called Putin Team, a pro-Putin project in the 2018 presidential election that brought together many famous Russian athletes and showbiz stars.
Ovechkin is a great hockey player, but his position is clear. He is a Putin supporter. After all, he still has that photo on Instagram. He supported Putin long after the annexation of Crimea. He is a supporter of the war. Alexander Ovechkin is a supporter of the war. If someone is a supporter of Putin, then he is a supporter of murder, a supporter of the occupation of Ukrainian territory, an independent, democratic country.
In 2022, Ovechkin had to change his shoes a bit. In order not to lose his multi-million-dollar contracts in the NHL, he resorted to the convenient rhetoric of "I'm out of politics and for world peace." But on Instagram, where the hockey player has 1.5 million followers, he still has a photo with Putin on his avatar. In 2023, Ovechkin received a letter of appreciation from the Russian president for his labor achievements and many years of conscientious work. He also visited Russia, where he was presented with a Lada for some reason.
Because you are so cool and awesome, we decided to take this opportunity to give you this car. Every time Ovechkin goes on the ice, it's a huge advertisement for the Russian war. It's a huge advertisement for Russian crimes, including the genocide of Ukrainian children. And the NHL is responsible for that. The NHL is part of the democratic world. The NHL should never let him on the ice. Because of the NHL, which sets these rules, more people are dying in Ukraine.
Nowadays, any well-known athlete has their own Instagram, and very often these Instagram accounts have millions of followers. When major events take place, they are broadcast live on social media, the internet, and on TV, and they reach an audience of millions, sometimes even billions.
The Ukrainian sports portal Tribune has created and regularly updates the list of shame, a database of athletes, coaches, and sports officials who have publicly supported Putin's aggression. The list has been updated, and there are already more than 700 of them. For example, gymnasts Arina and Dina Averiny, figure skaters Alena Kostarnaya, Kamila Valieva, Yelizaveta Tukhtamysheva, skiers Alexander Bolshunov, Alexander Lekhkov, and Veronika Stepanova, wrestler Roman Vlasov, football player Artem Dzuba, and many, many others.
Sports people are pillars of society. They represent so much more than just what they're doing on the field of play. And so to allow that to continue whilst such a grave situation is underway in Ukraine is wrong, morally, in my opinion.
In March 2022, Russian gymnast Ivan Kulyak won bronze at the last tournament to which Russians were admitted, and went to the World Cup award ceremony with the letter Z on his suit, the main symbol of Russian aggression against Ukraine. This did not go unnoticed, and the athlete was disqualified for a year. The story continued in Russia. The governor of the Kaluga region, Vladislav Shapsha, covered Kulyak's legal fees because it was a courageous act that made us proud of the athletes. Thank you, son. We are so proud. Such examples, not condemnation of the war, inspire Russian fans. They will be inspired, of course, by the decision of the International Olympic Committee. After several months of deliberation, the International Olympic Committee finally allowed Russians and Belarusians in neutral status to participate in the Olympic Games in Paris.
This is the worst possible decision. It's a huge effort by the Russian government putting everybody else to get the Russians back. You have no idea how much it is if you convert it into money. It's tens or hundreds of billions of dollars. It's just an incredible boost to their propaganda. Allowing Russian athletes to participate in the Olympics is the same as if we sent them 1,000 aircraft and 1,000 tanks, maybe even more.
The point is sending a big message on the international stage that we will not condone this on any level. And the idea that Russians can compete under a neutral banner, well, it's not neutral, is it? Because imagine Daniil Medvedev wins tennis gold at the next Olympics. Imagine Daniil Medvedev wins tennis gold at the next Olympics, which is wholly possible. What does Putin do? He will be holding that up. No matter what anyone says right now, he will be holding that up and showing the rest of Russia how great they are. And that cannot be allowed.
The decision to allow the Russians to participate also shows that in the modern sports world there is no responsibility for violating the long-standing tradition of the Olympic truce, which Russia has violated more than once.
There is such a thing as the Olympic truce, which begins 3 weeks before the Olympics and ends 3 weeks after the Paralympics, because these competitions usually go hand in hand. And Russia violated this Olympic truce in 2008 when it attacked Georgia. Then it violated it in 2014 with Crimea. And in 2022 it violated it again with a full-scale invasion that began almost immediately after the Olympics and before the Paralympics. And the fact that there were no sanctions for these previous violations is also, in my opinion, about Russia's influence, because it could afford it, realizing that it would not be punished for it.
The International Olympic Committee assures us that strict rules will prevent dishonest Russians from participating in the Olympics. However, we have already seen that this is not always the case. In addition, the committee's recommendations do not apply to Russians who are themselves members of the Olympic Committee. 6 of them do not meet the criteria for not supporting the war.
I think the fact that, that there are people on various sporting committees, not only the IOC, who have such compromised positions in some cases, just shows how difficult it is to change the fundamental structure of sport into a fair and democratic and human rights respecting one. It's very difficult in sport when people are in positions of power. It's very difficult to get them out. It's like politics in many ways now. Sport and politics are so intertwined, and I think sporting structures in major bodies like the IOC, like UEFA, like FIFA now, are not designed to freshen things up and to bring in younger, more relevant members and become more democratic. And I think the IOC is a good example. It's very hard to move out people who are already in these positions.
Of course, Russia is a strong country, mainly because of its oil and natural gas. And the money they use to control many companies has a lot of influence. They are doing everything to get those Russian athletes back. Of course, there is money involved, but you always have to ask yourself, what is worth more, billions of dollars or human life? For me, the answer is obvious.
The World Athletics Association is not going to lift the ban for athletes from aggressor countries. Russians and Belarusians will not be able to compete in athletics at the Olympic Games, despite the fact that the International Olympic Committee has allowed them to participate.
I became acting president of the Athletic Federation 2 months before the full-scale invasion. And the full-scale invasion began, and our most important question was how to survive, how to save and relocate our athletes and coaches. There were round-the-clock calls and correspondence with the presidents of athletic federations throughout Europe and most countries of the world. Please take in the athletes, take in the coaches, accommodate them, and they are with their parents, and they are with their younger sisters, and they need to be held somewhere, maybe for a month, maybe more. The second issue was the fight against Russian Federation and Russian athletics in the world.
In November 2022, the Athletics Federation Council met in Rome to discuss how to bring Russians back to competitions.
Just before the vote, I met with almost every member of the world athletics community, representatives from different countries, Asia, Africa, Europe, America, and so on, in the hotel lobby, showed videos, showed photos of our murdered athletes, showed horror videos that I personally either filmed or have on our social media. I explained that it was the Russians, it was Bucha, it was Irpin. They tied the hands behind the back of a little boy, shot him in the head, and threw a family into a sewer manhole. And here is our athlete who was at the European Championships last year. And here you are awarding him third place, or you are shaking his hand. And here he is already dead, because he died near Bakhmut or near Izum.
Ukraine has a traditionally strong high jump team. In 2022, 3 Ukrainian women competed at the European Championship in Munich: Yaroslava Moguчих, Yulia Levchenko and Irina Gerashchenko.
And Katya Tabachnik could have come. She was number 4 in our national team, but she simply could not withstand the internal competition for this selection. Of course, everyone knows Katya in the international arena. She is a famous athlete. I was standing before the competition in the dugout, drinking coffee, opening Facebook, and the Russians shelled Kharkiv, and the missiles flew directly into the apartment of Katya Tabachnik's mother. Her mother was killed. And there is a photo report from this place. There is just a destroyed apartment, and Katya's medals are scattered. Her starting numbers from international competitions are scattered. The president of the International Athletics Federation came up to me and said, "How are you?" I said, "Look at this." And he, "Who?" I said, "That's Katya's mom." He knows her, of course, and for him it was a shock. That's it. He forgot about the competition, he forgot about everything. And then he made a personal promise that he would do everything possible to prevent the Russians from returning.
On the day I write the script for this film, Ukrainian fencer Fedor Yepifanov dies in the war, an 18-year-old champion and winner of national competitions. He suspended his sports career because he went to defend his country. Over 360 Ukrainian athletes and coaches have been killed in the Russian war against Ukraine. They are called the angels of sports. None of them will ever return to compete again. Russian athletes are coming back.
Athletes are fighting, they are dying, and unfortunately no one abroad looks at this. No one is ready to look through this prism and realize that the suspension of Russian athletes is just equalizing the chances that are already unequal.
It is true that sports have always united people, but as I've always said, times change and we change with them. We have changed a lot, and the world definitely needs to change as well. Because we must be able to understand what is black and what is white, where the light is and where the darkness is.
As you can see, sport is a powerful tool of propaganda. It is an integral part of great Russian lie. And what is worst, the world already knows about this. The war continues, and the largest arenas again applaud Russian officers in sports uniforms.